A cry in the shadows. Cristiano Ronaldo had always believed in hard work, perseverance, and the power of giving back. From a boy who grew up in humble beginnings to one of the greatest footballers in history, he never forgot where he came from. The world saw him as a global icon, but those closest to him knew he was a man who valued kindness just as much as his trophies. It was a rainy evening in Madrid. The streets were wet, and the dim streetlights reflected on the glistening pavement. Ronaldo had just finished a charity event and was making his way to his car, surrounded by security and a few close friends. The night was chilly, and most people had already sought shelter in their warm homes. But amidst the crowd, something caught his eye. A girl, frail and shivering, sitting near a bus stop, clutching an old blanket that barely covered her. At first, he almost walked past her, but something inside him urged him to stop. "Senor, we should keep moving," one of his security team advised. Ronaldo hesitated, then turned back toward the girl. She looked no older than 10 or 11, her face thin, her eyes sunken but wide with a mix of fear and desperation. Her clothes were worn out, her hands clutched together for warmth, and her cheeks bore the stains of dried tears. As he crouched down in front of her, she flinched slightly, as if expecting harm. But when she looked up and met his gaze, her eyes held something else. Recognition. You're Cristiano Ronaldo," she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible above the drizzling rain. Ronaldo gave her a warm smile. "Yes. What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "Elena," she finally said. "Elena, where are your parents?" he asked gently. She bit her lip, looking down at the ground. "I don't have anyone anymore." A lump formed in Ronaldo's throat. "Where do you stay?" She hesitated again before whispering, "Here, anywhere I can." Ronaldo glanced around. The city was bustling, yet no one seemed to notice her. He had been in many places, met many people, but something about this girl struck him differently. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Elena nodded hesitantly. Ronaldo reached into his pocket and pulled out some money, but before he could hand it to her, she shook her head. "I don't need money," she murmured. I just need help." Ronaldo paused, his fingers curling around the cash. He had met countless fans, had given away more money than he could remember, but this wasn't about charity. This was something deeper. "All right," he said, standing up. "Come with me." Her eyes widened. "What? You said you need help, right?" He smiled. "I can't leave you here." She hesitated. Trust wasn't easy when life had been so cruel, but there was something about him, something sincere. After a moment, she nodded. Ronaldo signaled to his driver and security team, who looked confused but followed orders without question. Elena stepped into the car hesitantly, still gripping her blanket. As they drove off, Ronaldo turned to her. "Tell me everything, Elena." And so her story began. The dark past. Elena had once had a family, a mother and a father who loved her dearly. Her father had been a construction worker, her mother a seamstress. They lived in a small but cozy apartment, and though they had little, they had love. But life had a cruel way of taking things away. A year ago, her father had fallen from a scaffolding while working on a high-rise building. He didn't survive. Her mother, devastated and unable to pay rent, struggled to keep them afloat. They had moved from shelter to shelter, her mother working tirelessly to feed her. But months later, the stress, the grief, and the struggle took its toll. Her mother fell ill, too sick to work, too weak to fight. One night, Elena had held her mother's hand as she whispered her last words, "Be strong, my love." And just like that, she was alone. She had tried to stay in the apartment, but the landlord threw her out. With no relatives, no one to turn to, she found herself on the streets, begging for food, hiding in alleys when the nights grew too cold. Until tonight, until Ronaldo. As she spoke, her voice trembled, but she did not cry. She had shed all her tears long ago. Ronaldo listened, his heart heavy. He had grown up in poverty himself, but he had never known this level of suffering. "Why didn't you go to an orphanage?" he asked. "I tried," she said, looking down. "But I got scared. Some kids there, they weren't kind. I thought, maybe I could do better on my own." He exhaled, glancing out the window. This was no life for a child. When they reached his home, Elena's eyes widened in awe. It wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. The gates opened, and the grand villa stood before her, lit like something out of a dream. "You can stay here for now," Ronaldo said. Her small hands gripped her blanket tighter. "Why are you helping me?" He knelt down to her level, his expression soft but firm. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing, and because everyone deserves a chance." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, she let them fall. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Elena slept in a warm bed, under a soft blanket, in a home where she felt safe. But this was only the beginning, a new beginning with shadows of the past. Elena had never known what it felt like to sleep in an actual bed with soft sheets and a warm blanket. For months, she had curled up on the cold pavement, using cardboard as a barrier between her and the harsh ground. But last night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had fallen asleep in a warm, secure place. The mattress beneath her had cradled her small frame, and the faint scent of fresh linen had surrounded her like a protective cocoon. Yet, despite the comfort, she had barely closed her eyes. The unfamiliar silence of the grand villa unsettled her. She had grown accustomed to the constant hum of the city, the distant shouts, the hurried footsteps, and the occasional rustling of plastic bags as fellow street dwellers searched for scraps. Here, the stillness felt foreign, almost too perfect, too quiet. She was afraid that if she let her guard down, this dream would end, and she would wake up back on the streets, back to the cruel reality that had defined her existence for too long. Morning light streamed through the large window, casting golden patterns across the room. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, half expecting her surroundings to disappear. But the room remained, large, elegant, yet strangely welcoming. The walls were adorned with framed jerseys, trophies gleamed on shelves, and a massive television hung on the opposite wall. It was clear she had been given a guest room, but it was more luxurious than anything she had ever seen. The air smelled of fresh coffee and something warm and buttery. Her stomach growled involuntarily, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Slowly, she climbed out of bed, hesitant to disturb anything in this perfect space. As she stepped outside the room, she found herself in a vast hallway lined with modern artwork and photos of Cristiano Ronaldo with various teammates, family members, and moments frozen in time. The house was more than just grand. It carried a presence, a history of triumphs and sacrifices. She followed the scent of food, her bare feet making almost no sound against the cool marble floor. As she reached the dining area, she saw Ronaldo seated at the long table, sipping his coffee while scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she hesitated at the entrance, his sharp yet kind eyes softening when they met hers. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice calm yet full of authority. She swallowed nervously. "Good morning," she murmured, shifting uncomfortably. "Come, sit." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "You must be hungry." Elena hesitated for a brief moment before cautiously making her way to the table. In front of her was a plate filled with toast, scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, and a glass of milk. It had been so long since she had seen such a meal that she wasn't sure where to start. "It's okay," Ronaldo said, noticing her hesitation. "Eat as much as you want." She picked up the fork, taking a small bite of the eggs, expecting them to taste strange, as food usually did when she scavenged from the streets. But this was different. Warm, soft, delicious. The taste hit her like a wave of emotions, and before she knew it, she was eating faster, shoveling food into her mouth, afraid it would be taken away at any moment. Ronaldo watched her with a quiet expression, understanding her desperation without saying a word. He had seen hunger before. He had known it himself in his childhood. He let her eat in peace, only speaking when she finally slowed down, her small hands clutching the cup of milk as if it were a priceless treasure. "How did you end up in Madrid?" he asked gently, breaking the silence. Elena hesitated, her fingers tightening around the glass. "My mother and I came here when I was little. My father had already passed away, and she thought we could find work, a better life." Her voice wavered. "But she got sick, and then she was gone too." Ronaldo exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He had heard stories of struggle before, but something about Elena's resilience struck a chord deep within him. She was just a child, yet she had faced more hardship than most adults. He knew then that he couldn't just give her temporary shelter. He needed to change her life. "Do you want to go to school?" he asked suddenly. Elena blinked in surprise. "School?" He nodded. "You're still young. You should be learning, not worrying about where your next meal will come from." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I haven't been to school in a long time. What if I'm too behind? What if they make fun of me?" "You don't have to do this alone," Ronaldo reassured her. "I'll make sure you have everything you need." Elena looked up at him, searching for any hint of deception. But all she found was sincerity. She had spent so long distrusting people, expecting the worst, that it was difficult to accept kindness without suspicion. But this was Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most famous and respected athletes in the world. Why would he lie to her? A lump formed in her throat, and she gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Ronaldo smiled. "Good. We'll figure it out together." Over the next few days, Elena slowly adjusted to her new reality. She received new clothes, proper shoes, and even a few books to start familiarizing herself with basic subjects. Ronaldo arranged for a private tutor to assess her learning level and help her catch up. She was hesitant at first, feeling out of place in such a structured environment, but she soon found herself enjoying it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't merely surviving, she was living. Yet, despite the kindness, despite the security, there was always a shadow of fear lingering in the back of her mind. She was terrified that this would all disappear, that something would go wrong, and she would be back on the streets, alone once again. The trauma of her past was not so easily erased. One evening, Ronaldo found her sitting outside by the garden, her knees drawn to her chest. He approached quietly, sensing something was wrong. "Elena," he said softly, sitting beside her. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated before speaking. What if this doesn't last?" He frowned slightly. "Why wouldn't it?" "Because nothing good ever does," she admitted. "Every time I thought things were getting better, something happened to take it all away." Ronaldo exhaled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I can't promise that life will always be easy, Elena. But I can promise that you're not alone anymore. You don't have to fight every battle by yourself." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time, they weren't from pain or sadness. They were from something she had forgotten how to feel. Hope. She wiped her eyes quickly and nodded. "Okay," she whispered again. Ronaldo smiled. "Now come inside. Tomorrow's a big day. We have a lot to prepare for." As she followed him back into the house, something inside her shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a temporary escape. Maybe this was the beginning of something real. But the past wasn't done with her yet, and neither were the shadows that followed her. Shadows from the past. Elena had begun to settle into her new life, though the transition was anything but easy. She was no longer scrounging for food or sleeping in the cold, but the habits of survival were not easily forgotten. Every time she ate a meal, she would still glance around nervously, half expecting someone to snatch her plate away. At night, even in the safety of Ronaldo's grand villa, she would wake up startled, her heart pounding, as if she were still on the streets. The trauma of her past clung to her like a shadow, whispering in the back of her mind that this was all temporary, that one wrong move would send her back to the life she had barely escaped. Ronaldo noticed these things, but he didn't push her. He had learned that wounds like hers wouldn't heal overnight. Instead, he made sure she had everything she needed: new clothes, warm meals, tutors, and a safe space to breathe. But more importantly, he gave her time. He knew that trust wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. One afternoon, after a tutoring session, Elena found herself wandering through the vast halls of the villa. The walls were lined with photos of Ronaldo's career, his first championship win, the golden trophies, moments frozen in time with teammates who had become like family. She stopped in front of a particular frame, a photo of Ronaldo as a young boy, wearing a simple jersey, his hair messy, his face determined even then. "You recognize him?" A voice came from behind her. She turned to see Ronaldo leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's you," she said, pointing at the photo. "But you look different." He chuckled, stepping forward. "That was me back when I was your age. Back before all this." He gestured around him. "Before the stadiums, before the fame." Elena stared at the photo. "You didn't grow up rich." Ronaldo shook his head. "No, I grew up in a small home with my family in Madeira. We didn't have much, but we had each other. I had to fight for everything I have now." Elena hesitated before asking, "Were you ever scared that you'd never make it?" Ronaldo's smile faded slightly, his gaze growing distant. "All the time. When I left my family to train at the academy, I cried every night. I was alone, and I missed home. But I knew if I gave up, I'd never change my life. So I kept going." Elena absorbed his words, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "I want to believe I can change my life too," she admitted. "But what if I can't?" Ronaldo knelt beside her, his expression serious. "You already have," he said firmly. "You survived things no child should ever have to. That means you're stronger than you think. But strength isn't just about surviving. It's about believing you deserve more than just survival." Elena looked up at him, her eyes uncertain but filled with something new: hope. But hope was fragile, and sometimes the past had a way of creeping back when you least expected it. That night, as Elena was reading a book in her room, a knock at the door startled her. It wasn't Ronaldo. It was one of the house staff. "There's someone at the gate asking for you," the woman said hesitantly. Elena's stomach twisted. "Who?" The woman looked unsure. "A man. He says he knows you." Elena's breath caught in her throat. A man. The only people who had ever known her were the ones on the streets, and none of them were the type to come looking for her. Fear tightened around her chest as she followed the woman toward the front entrance. When she reached the gate, she saw him. A tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and dark, piercing eyes. His clothes were tattered, his hands rough and weathered from years of hardship. But it wasn't his appearance that sent a chill down Elena's spine. It was his eyes. She knew those eyes. "Elena," the man said, his voice low, almost coaxing. "I've been looking for you." Her legs locked in place. I don't know you," she stammered, though she knew she was lying. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, but you do." Memories she had buried deep within her mind clawed their way to the surface. She remembered him. One of the men her mother had begged for help when she had first fallen ill. He had seemed kind at first, offering small favors, bringing them scraps of food. But there was always something off about him. When her mother had passed, she had done everything she could to avoid him. He had always told her that she owed him, that she would have to repay him one day. She had run, hidden in alleys, slept in different places every night just to escape him. And now he was here. "What do you want?" she forced herself to ask. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You disappeared on me, little one. But now I see you're doing well. Living in a nice house, with quite the host." He glanced toward the villa, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "I think you and I need to talk about what you owe me." Panic surged through her. "I don't owe you anything," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice smooth but filled with unspoken threats. "You didn't think all those meals, those little favors came for free, did you? I took care of you when no one else would. Now it's time for you to return the favor." Elena felt sick. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen in place. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "She doesn't owe you anything." Elena turned sharply to see Ronaldo standing a few feet behind her, his expression calm but unmistakably dangerous. His presence alone seemed to shift the air. His eyes locked onto the man with a quiet fury that made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. The man's confidence faltered for a brief second before he regained his smirk. "Ah, the famous Cristiano Ronaldo," he mused. "Didn't realize you were in the business of taking in strays." Ronaldo didn't flinch. "Elena isn't a stray. She's family now." The man's smirk faded. "Family," he scoffed. "That's touching. But family doesn't erase debts." Ronaldo stepped forward, his presence towering. "She doesn't owe you anything. And if you ever come near her again, you'll regret it." The man's face twisted in frustration, but he was smart enough to know he was outmatched. He let out a cold chuckle, shaking his head. "We'll see about that," he muttered before turning and disappearing into the night. Elena's knees almost gave out as relief and terror crashed over her. She had spent so long fearing that man, running from him. And now he knew where she was. Ronaldo placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's not coming back," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Elena looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "What if he does?" she whispered. Ronaldo's expression hardened. "Then he'll have to go through me first." For the first time in her life, Elena wasn't facing her battles alone. But the past wasn't done with her yet, and neither was the danger that lurked in the shadows. The storm within and the war outside. Elena couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of the man at the gate, the one who had haunted her past and now threatened her future. Even though Ronaldo had promised to protect her, fear had a way of creeping in, whispering doubts into her mind. What if the man came back? What if he wasn't alone next time? What if she was putting Ronaldo in danger just by being here? She sat up, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping herself in the blanket as if it could shield her from her thoughts. The villa was quiet, but silence had never comforted her. It only made the echoes of her past louder. Every time she closed her eyes, memories resurfaced. The cold nights on the streets, the hunger gnawing at her stomach, the constant fear of being taken by someone cruel enough to exploit her. That man had always been lurking in the background, watching, waiting, and now he knew where she was. Unable to take it any longer, she climbed out of bed and tiptoed through the dimly lit hallway. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she needed to move, to do something other than drown in her own fear. As she wandered through the massive house, she found herself drawn to the training room. She had seen Ronaldo practice here before, spending hours perfecting his skills, pushing himself beyond his limits. She wasn't a footballer, but she envied the way he carried himself. The confidence, the strength, the unshakable belief that no obstacle was too great. She walked over to a punching bag hanging in the corner of the room, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. She wasn't strong like Ronaldo. She wasn't powerful. She was just a girl who had barely survived. But something inside her, something small yet fierce, whispered that she didn't always have to be this way. Balling her fists, she threw a weak punch at the bag. It barely moved. She frowned and tried again, but her strikes were unsteady, unfocused. She wasn't used to fighting. She was used to running. But maybe that needed to change. A voice broke through the silence. "Not bad, but you're hitting like you're afraid of it." Elena whirled around to find Ronaldo standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with mild amusement. His hair was slightly messy, and he was in sweatpants and a hoodie, as if he had just woken up. "I didn't mean to wake you," she mumbled, stepping back from the bag. "You didn't," he replied, stepping into the room. "I heard you moving around. Thought I'd check on you." He glanced at the punching bag, then back at her. "You want to learn how to throw a real punch?" Elena hesitated. "I don't know how." "That's why I'm offering to teach you," he said with a small smirk. "Come here." She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Ronaldo positioned himself behind her, gently adjusting her stance. Feet shoulder-width apart. "Balance is everything." His voice was calm, instructive. "Now, when you punch, don't just use your arm. Put your whole body into it. Your hips, your shoulders. Power comes from movement, not just strength." Elena nodded, following his instructions. He guided her through a few slow motions before letting her try on her own. When she struck the bag this time, there was more force behind it. Not much, but enough to feel different. Ronaldo nodded approvingly. "Better. You're stronger than you think." She looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Do you really think I can be strong?" He met her gaze, his tone serious. "Elena, you already are. Strength isn't just about hitting hard. It's about standing back up every time life knocks you down." She swallowed hard, absorbing his words. For so long, she had seen herself as weak, as someone who had barely scraped by. But maybe survival itself was a kind of strength. As the night stretched on, Ronaldo continued teaching her small self-defense techniques. Nothing advanced, just the basics of standing her ground, defending herself if she ever needed to. By the time they were done, she was exhausted but felt something she hadn't in a long time. Control. "Go get some rest," Ronaldo finally said, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Tomorrow, we'll train again." She nodded, and for the first time in days, felt a small spark of hope. The next morning, Ronaldo wasted no time taking action regarding the threat from the man at the gate. He had already spoken to his security team, instructing them to strengthen the surveillance around the villa. Every entrance, every pathway was being monitored. No one was getting in without his permission. But Ronaldo knew that wasn't enough. He needed to find out exactly who this man was and what he wanted. Later that afternoon, as Elena was in her tutoring session, Ronaldo made a few calls. Within hours, he had a name. Miguel Duarte, a known hustler involved in petty crimes, occasionally working as a middleman for more dangerous people. He wasn't someone to be taken lightly. That night, Ronaldo sat down with Elena at the dinner table, his tone calm but firm. "I need you to tell me everything you know about him." Elena looked down at her plate, gripping her fork tightly. "I told you, he used to help my mom. Gave us food sometimes, but after she was gone, he started saying I owed him. I tried to stay away, but he always found me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He never hurt me, but I was always scared he would." Ronaldo's jaw tightened. The idea of someone preying on a child like that made his blood boil. "You're not alone anymore, Elena," he assured her. "He won't touch you." She nodded, but he could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. Later that night, Ronaldo made another call, this time to someone who specialized in dealing with problems like Miguel. If this man thought he could intimidate Elena, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. But as much as Ronaldo was taking precautions, he knew one thing. Miguel wouldn't just walk away. Men like him never did. And when the past came knocking again, Ronaldo would be ready. Elena, however, would have to decide something for herself. Would she keep running from her fears? Or would she stand and fight? The battle was far from over. The test of fear and fire. Elena woke up with a weight pressing down on her chest. Not the weight of blankets, but the suffocating feeling of fear. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and an unshakable sense that the life she was beginning to build was under threat. She had spent too long running, hiding, surviving. But now, for the first time, she had something to lose, and that made the fear even worse. She sat up in bed, her fingers gripping the sheets as she tried to steady her breathing. The villa was silent, bathed in the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the curtains. She wanted to believe that she was safe here, that Ronaldo's protection was enough to keep the nightmares of her past at bay. But Miguel's presence at the gate had shattered that illusion. He had found her. He knew where she was. And men like him didn't just give up. Slipping out of bed, she padded barefoot to the window and gazed down at the vast property below. Security guards patrolled the perimeter, their presence reassuring but also a reminder that danger was real. Ronaldo had taken her in, given her shelter, food, education, and even the chance to learn how to fight. But none of that would matter if she was too afraid to stand her ground when it mattered most. She clenched her fists. She had to be stronger than this. The morning routine at the villa was already in full swing by the time Elena made her way to the kitchen. The scent of fresh coffee and toast filled the air, and she found Ronaldo seated at the dining table, dressed in his workout gear, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as she entered, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Morning," he greeted. "Morning," she murmured, sitting across from him. He studied her for a moment, then set his phone down. "Did you sleep at all?" Elena shrugged, picking at the toast on her plate. "A little." Ronaldo leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're thinking about Miguel." She looked up sharply, caught off guard by his directness. But she didn't deny it. "He's not going to stop," she admitted quietly. "Not unless someone makes him." Ronaldo's expression darkened slightly. "He won't get near you, Elena. I made sure of that." She nodded, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. "I don't want to just be protected, Ronaldo. I want to protect myself." He studied her carefully, his sharp mind picking up on the determination beneath her fear. He had seen this before, the look of someone who had spent their life being helpless, but had finally reached the breaking point where they refused to be a victim anymore. "Come with me," he said, standing up. Elena hesitated but followed him through the villa and out toward the training facility. She had been here before, learning small self-defense moves, but today felt different. There was a shift in the air, a new intensity in Ronaldo's demeanor. He handed her a pair of gloves and gestured toward the punching bag. "Show me what you've learned." She swallowed hard, then positioned herself as he had taught her. Her first few punches were weak, hesitant. She still held back, still feared what would happen if she struck out too hard. "Stop," Ronaldo said, his voice firm. He stepped closer, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "You're pulling your punches. Why?" She bit her lip, not answering. He exhaled and crouched down slightly so they were eye level. "You're still afraid," he said quietly. "You think that hitting back makes you just like him, like the people who hurt you." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I don't want to be like them." "You're not," Ronaldo said firmly. "Defending yourself isn't the same as hurting people. Protecting yourself doesn't make you bad. It makes you stronger." She clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. She hated this feeling, this fear that refused to leave, the weakness that clung to her like a second skin. "Again," Ronaldo said, stepping back. This time, when she hit the bag, there was more force behind it. She thought of all the times she had been hungry, cold, scared. She thought of the nights she had spent hiding, the times she had felt powerless. And with every strike, she imagined breaking free from all of it. By the time she was done, her arms ached, her breath was ragged, and sweat dripped down her forehead. But there was something else, too, something she hadn't felt before. Power. Ronaldo nodded approvingly. "That's better." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, staring at him. "Do you think I'll ever stop being afraid?" He was silent for a moment before answering. "Fear never really goes away. But you learn to live with it. And you learn to fight back." Elena exhaled, nodding. She wasn't there yet, but for the first time, she believed she could be. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a different kind of tension settled over the villa. Ronaldo had received a call from one of his contacts. Miguel wasn't just some random thug. He was connected to something bigger, something darker. And he wasn't done trying to get to Elena. Ronaldo stood by the balcony, staring out at the city, his jaw tight. He had been in many fights before, not just on the field, but in life. He had worked his way up from nothing, carved his own path with sheer willpower. And now he had someone to protect, someone who reminded him too much of the boy he used to be. The one who had been told he wouldn't make it, the one who had to fight every single day to prove the world wrong. When he heard footsteps behind him, he turned to find Elena standing there. She was different now. Still small, still fragile in some ways, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "What happens now?" she asked. Ronaldo folded his arms. "We prepare." "For what?" "For whatever comes next." Elena nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. She was done being a victim. She was done running. And so was Ronaldo. Because the next time Miguel came knocking, he wouldn't just be facing a scared little girl. He'd be facing the storm she had become. And Cristiano Ronaldo would make sure of it. The war at the door. The air inside the villa felt heavier that night, even though everything seemed normal. The security guards patrolled their assigned routes, the staff moved about their usual routines, and the lights in the house gave off a warm glow. There was something unspoken lingering in the silence. It wasn't just Elena who felt it. Ronaldo did too. He had spent years trusting his instincts, knowing when danger was just a shadow on the wall, and when it was real, creeping closer with every breath. Tonight, that instinct told him that something was coming. Elena sat on the couch in the living room, pretending to read a book, but she wasn't really absorbing the words. She was too distracted, her mind caught in a cycle of worry. Miguel hadn't made another appearance since that night at the gate, but she knew he wasn't gone. He was waiting, watching. She had seen people like him before, people who took their time, who enjoyed the game of power, who never truly disappeared. He had let her slip through his fingers once before. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. She glanced toward Ronaldo, who stood near the massive glass doors leading to the backyard, speaking on the phone in a hushed voice. His expression was unreadable, but his body was tense. He had been making calls all day, speaking with people she didn't know, arranging things she couldn't understand. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this slide. He was planning something. As if sensing her eyes on him, Ronaldo turned to look at her. His sharp gaze softened slightly, but there was still something unreadable in it. He ended the call and walked over, taking the seat across from her. "How's the book?" he asked, nodding toward the untouched pages in her lap. She exhaled. "I haven't really been reading it." Ronaldo nodded, as if he expected that answer. "You're thinking about him?" Elena hesitated before admitting, yes. There was no point in lying. They both knew the truth. Ronaldo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen to me. I've handled guys like Miguel before. He thinks he's in control. He thinks he can intimidate you into giving him what he wants." His voice was firm, unwavering. "But he doesn't know who he's up against." Elena studied him. "You mean you?" Ronaldo gave a small smirk. "Not just me." He gestured toward her. "You." She frowned. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are," he interrupted. "You've survived things most people wouldn't even understand. That's strength." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "But now, it's time to stop just surviving. It's time to fight." Elena swallowed hard. The idea of fighting back had always felt like a fantasy. On the streets, fighting could mean losing everything. It was safer to run, to disappear. But now, she had a home. She had people who cared. And she had someone who believed in her. For the first time, she wondered what would happen if she stopped being afraid. The following morning, Ronaldo took her to an empty training facility, not the one in his home, but somewhere more isolated, where no one would see them. The drive there was quiet, the tension between them unspoken but understood. Elena didn't ask questions. She knew why they were here. When they arrived, Ronaldo led her into a large room lined with mirrors, punching bags, and mats. He didn't waste time with small talk. He tossed her a pair of gloves and said, "Let's get to work." At first, the training was similar to what they had done before. Stance, balance, punches. But today, Ronaldo pushed her harder. "You're still hesitating," he said as she struck the bag. "You need to hit like you mean it." She gritted her teeth and threw another punch. Harder, faster, but it still wasn't enough. Ronaldo stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "You're not just hitting the bag, Elena. You're hitting everything that's ever tried to break you." She stared at him, her breathing heavy. "Close your eyes," he instructed. She hesitated but obeyed. "Think of every time you've been scared, every time someone made you feel powerless, every time you wanted to fight back but couldn't." His voice was steady, guiding her deeper into her own memories. "Now open your eyes." And hit. Her eyes snapped open. And this time, when she struck the bag, it was different. It wasn't just a punch. It was a release. A declaration. Ronaldo smiled. "Now that's what I'm talking about." That night, back at the villa, the unease returned. Elena sat in her room, staring out the window, half expecting to see Miguel lurking in the darkness. But the streets were empty, the villa well guarded. She knew Ronaldo had increased security. He wasn't taking any chances. She should have felt safe, but something didn't feel right. Then, a sound. Soft, subtle, but enough to make her tense. She stood up, her pulse racing. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. She stepped into the hallway, listening carefully. The house was mostly dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. But then she heard it again. Footsteps. Not from a guard. Someone else. Elena's stomach twisted. She turned the corner and nearly gasped. A shadow moved through the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Not rushing, not sneaking. Just moving, like it belonged there. Elena took a step back, her breathing shallow. But before she could move again, a voice cut through the silence. "Elena." She froze. Miguel stood at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. His face was calm, too calm. His presence here, inside the villa, made her blood run cold. "How did you?" she started, but he cut her off. "You thought a few guards could keep me out." He smiled, and it sent shivers down her spine. "I told you, little one, you owe me." Panic flared in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. She couldn't run. Not this time. Miguel took a slow step forward. "Be smart, Elena. Come with me, and no one gets hurt." She clenched her fists. "No." Miguel's eyes darkened. "You don't get to say no." But before he could take another step, a new voice cut through the air, sharp, unwavering. "She does." Miguel barely had time to react before Ronaldo stepped into the light, his expression like stone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He was just ready. And in that moment, Elena knew this wasn't going to end with words. Miguel had finally made his move. But so had they. The final stand. The air inside the villa was thick with tension, a storm brewing within its very walls. Miguel stood at the far end of the hallway, his smirk laced with arrogance, his dark eyes scanning the room like a predator sizing up its prey. He was a man who had lived his life taking what he wanted, a man who believed in fear as his greatest weapon. But tonight, he had walked into the wrong house. Elena's pulse pounded against her ribs, her hands balled into fists at her sides. She had spent her life running, hiding, escaping the clutches of men like him. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had someone standing beside her. Cristiano Ronaldo didn't need to raise his voice to be commanding. He didn't need threats to establish dominance. His presence alone was enough. He stood tall, his gaze locked onto Miguel with the unwavering confidence of a man who had never lost a battle worth fighting. "You made a mistake coming here," Ronaldo said, his voice low but deadly. Miguel chuckled, the sound casual, but Elena saw it, the flicker of unease in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a frightened little girl, maybe a few guards he could slip past. What he hadn't accounted for was going toe-to-toe with a man like Ronaldo. "I don't make mistakes," Miguel replied smoothly, though his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. "I came to collect what's mine." Elena felt her stomach twist. He still thought he owned her, like she was some lost debt, a piece of property that could be claimed. "You don't own anything," Ronaldo countered, stepping forward, his movements calculated, controlled. "Especially not her." Miguel tilted his head, pretending to consider the words. "You're making this difficult, Cristiano," he mused. "I don't want trouble. Just hand over the girl, and we'll forget this ever happened." Elena bristled. Her fingers curled tighter, her nails digging into her palms, every fiber of her being told her to hide, to step back, to let Ronaldo handle this. But something inside her had changed. She stepped forward. Miguel's eyes snapped to her, and for the first time, his smirk wavered. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I don't owe you anything. I never did." Miguel let out a slow breath, as if she had just disappointed him. "That's not how this works, Corrida," he murmured. "You don't get to choose." Elena clenched her jaw. "I do now." The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Miguel realized, in that moment, that the scared little girl he had once preyed upon was gone. Ronaldo, however, had run out of patience. "You've got 10 seconds to leave my house," he stated, his voice sharp as steel. Miguel's smirk returned, but it was weaker this time. "And if I don't?" Ronaldo's answer wasn't in words. It was in movement. Fast, precise, lethal. Before Miguel could react, Ronaldo was on him. One sharp blow to the chest sent the man stumbling back, his breath escaping in a startled grunt. He recovered quickly, swinging wildly, but Ronaldo was faster. He ducked, countered, and landed a punch to Miguel's jaw that sent him crashing into the wall. Miguel groaned, but his pride forced him to push back up. His hand darted to his pocket, and for a split second, Elena saw it, metal glinting under the dim light. A knife. Her heart seized. Without thinking, she moved. Miguel lunged forward, the blade aimed directly at Ronaldo. But before he could reach him, Elena stepped in, her instincts overriding her fear. Everything happened in a blur. She grabbed Miguel's wrist, twisting it with all the strength she had learned in training. Pain flashed across his face as the knife clattered to the ground. She used his moment of shock to shove him back with all her weight, sending him stumbling onto the floor. Silence filled the hallway. Elena stood there, her breath heaving, her hands shaking. She had just fought back. Ronaldo, without missing a beat, reached down and kicked the knife away, his eyes locked onto Miguel. "You lost," he said simply. Miguel knew it too. He was breathing hard, clutching his wrist where Elena had twisted it. His arrogance had shattered, replaced with something else. Defeat. Ronaldo signaled to his security team, who had already entered the hallway. They wasted no time grabbing Miguel and dragging him to his feet. "You'll regret this," Miguel spat, his voice dripping with venom. Ronaldo smiled coldly. "No, you will." And with that, Miguel was taken away. The moment he was gone, the weight of everything crashed down on Elena. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling with adrenaline. She turned to Ronaldo, expecting a lecture, a reprimand for putting herself in danger. But instead, he just studied her, his expression unreadable. "You stepped in," he finally said. Elena swallowed. I couldn't let him. You fought back, he interrupted, his gaze sharp. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But then Ronaldo did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the usual polite, public smile he gave to cameras. A real, genuine smile. You're stronger than you think, he said. A lump formed in her throat. For so long, she had believed she was weak, powerless, just a girl trying to survive. But tonight, she had proved something to herself. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Epilogue. A new dawn. Days passed, and Miguel disappeared from their lives, arrested and facing a long list of charges. The threat that had once loomed over Elena was gone, but more importantly, something inside her had changed forever. She trained harder than ever, not because she was afraid, but because she refused to be a victim ever again. She continued her studies, embracing the chance to build a future beyond the shadows of her past. One afternoon, as she finished her lessons, she found Ronaldo waiting outside. "How about a match?" he asked, kicking a football toward her. She grinned, catching it with her foot. "You really think I can keep up?" Ronaldo smirked. "Let's see what you've got." As she ran onto the field, chasing after the ball, the wind in her hair and the sun on her skin, she realized something. She wasn't the same girl who had sat shivering on a cold street corner, waiting for the world to be kind to her. She was strong. She was free. And for the first time, she was truly home.